Dawn Llewellyn. Thank you so much for joining me, and a very warm welcome to Thrive Solo. It is fabulous to have you here. Now, before we get into our conversation, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I can indeed. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's very exciting to be on your podcast, Lucy. It's
Ah,
really a thrill.
you're
So
welcome.
my day job, if you like, and my full title, which is a bit of a mouthful, is I'm an associate professor of religion and gender at the University of Chester.
Wow.
Which, when people sort of ask me what that means, I say, well, I tend to interview sort of women, inclusively women, about how religion is shit for them and what they do about it and how they get out of it or stay. So that's my sort of day job. And I mainly
Wow.
teach sociology, some religious studies. And then my research has always been around giving a sort of feminist perspective on how women navigate religious structures and particularly Christianity. So I like to track that.
Very
And part of
interesting.
well, it's often a bit of a conversation stopper, right? You get into a taxi and someone asks you what you do, and it either prompts quite an interesting response or, cuts the conversation quite short. But yeah, it's brilliant. We have lovely students and brilliant colleagues. And that's where my interest in childlessness emerged from, actually, was my work. So as a feminist, I'm always looking for the places and the tensions where women's lived religious identity might come into contact or clash with social expectations or how they feel about their own lives. And I was starting to notice that those sort of rates around childlessness, particularly sort of, that 1 in 5 women will remain childless statistic, was looming large when about 10 or 12 years ago. And I started to think, well, what happens if you're part of an institution like Christianity, which has a really strong message that not only should you have kids, which we have in society anyway, but somehow that's heightened because it's encased in these sacred obligations and religious institutions, and it's supposed to be the outworking of a woman's sort of Christian identity in life. Well, what happens if you don't want children, or you're ambivalent, or you're not sure? Or what if you thought even motherhood was a choice? So as part of that work, I was starting to interview women who felt that they had a choice, and some of them were childless by choice. They'd made a very clear decision, which really transgressed a lot of their sort of faith background and context. And at the same time, I was in my early 30s, and I was starting to think I wasn't really sure about whether I would want children or not and what that would mean. And so my sort of personal story is really interwoven with some of that research, even though I'm not Christian. I don't identify as Christian. I just like talking to sort of Christian women about the tricky things that shape their lives.
Absolutely fascinating. I'd love to hear a bit about some stories of, because I know a couple of women spring to mind who I know are very, very religious, and I know that they struggle with exactly what you've just been talking to. Can you go into this a little bit more about the struggles that women go through if they, I guess, if they decide they don't want kids, or if they end up not having them? Like, what experiences have you had of women in this kind of situation? Because it's actually not a conversation I've ever had on this podcast. But actually, I'm so pleased to be talking about it because there must be so many women out there who really, it like adds that extra layer of pressure, you
Mhm.
know?
That's right. And it's the other way around. In Western contexts, we've inherited this pronatalism, this privileging of the family as the central moral compass, unit, social structure from Christianity. It's part of that legacy, right? The way in which Christianity made that central to its message. We're still sort of living with that. And that's why in the West, we're used to that. So it's useful to bear that in mind. But for the women who I spoke to who chose not to have children, for some of them, there was a real guilt and a real stigma and a real taboo about disclosing that for them, they didn't see themselves as fulfilling their Christian identity through motherhood. And there was a couple of women who'd never told anybody else apart from their husbands that I was privileged enough for them to sort of say, to take part in the research because of that guilt and that stigma and the taboo. Because not only is nobody else really declaring that they don't want children, in some denominations, that message is so strong, particularly in kind of Catholic denominations. It's instilled and it's ingrained that your primary purpose in Catholic doctrine is to, as a woman, is to have children, because that perpetuates the Christian tradition. But also it's that really essentialist way about thinking about what women's bodies are for, what women should do, how women should be, that again we've inherited from Christianity largely. So there was one participant in particular. She said she was quite well known in her denomination, and she'd studied a lot and she taught, and she just said she couldn't tell anybody because she'd looked for resources, she'd looked for glimpses and spaces where she might be able to disclose that this was okay, and there wasn't any. There aren't resources. There's no script, very little script for Christian women, for those who've chosen not to have children, unless you're a nun, right? Or unless you're kind of taking on that sort of vocation, which, let's face it, not many people want to do. And it sort of gets rid of the question. Well, it doesn't get rid of the question of sex, actually. But, you know, on the surface, it gets rid of the question of sex. It's a different reason why you might be not having children. So the taboos were really, and the levels of guilt, and the secrecy. And one participant, I remember saying to me, I think I once met a woman like me, but we couldn't ever sort of break that silence. We kept sort of skirting around it, and they were never able to really have that conversation that you're having on your podcast, that we have with our friends about, we know people who don't have kids and why we don't have kids, and that solidarity, just really missing that friendship, that space to share those concerns. Other women felt that sort of pronatalist, family-centric message so strongly that they exiled from their church. It was too much. They didn't belong. It's not just the teaching and the doctrine that you might hear formally, it's the social practices and those expectations. Sometimes when I talk about my work publicly, I have women come up to me who can't have children. And although my research doesn't explicitly say that, this pronatalism, it affects if you it affects why you can't, your responses if you can't have children, and it affects, it's the reason that these taboos and stigmas are all in place. There's a lot, pronatalism has got a lot to answer for, quite frankly, Lucy. Yeah. And some of them have come up to me afterwards when I've given my talk and say, I can't have children, and that means in my church that I'm often prayed over, or it's suggested that I go into a particular women's group, and that just exacerbates the pressure. It's supposed to be supportive, but it can actually feel quite violent.
Can I just interject there? What do you mean they're prayed over?
So in some Christian traditions, the language of sort of barrenness and sin collapse, right? So some people might have heard in the pulpit, or they might have heard from their pastors, that one of the reasons that they can't have children is because of some misdemeanor, or there's the shadow of something sinful has happened, and therefore praying over them releases that sin, and then releases, you pray over and you heal them both spiritually and physically. So those healing ministries are supposed to alleviate the pain, and also hope that God can intervene.
Is it kind of like, well, we can quote cure them? That's
right. There's a bit of that, in some. So women have disclosed that that's happened to them in some of their church contexts. And that can be quite harmful, as you can imagine.
I find this really hard to stomach, honestly. I do.
It's not all churches, it's not all denominations at all. And the women who disclosed to me, they were doing it because there'd been a space sort of created, I guess, to think about their own experiences. But that's not uncommon. One of my really brilliant colleagues, Lisa Oakley at Chester, who I work with quite closely, she works on the concept of spiritual abuse, which is the way in which religions can harness the teachings or the scripture or their authority for coercive reasons, or for ways in which inflict power and pain over others. And it has terrible consequences for somebody's faith. It can make someone leave the church, it can leave them, disrupt them from their families, it can really make them doubt their faith in God. And her and I have sort of talked about how some of those approaches feel abusive for the women at the center of them for those reasons. So it's really difficult, and it's really sensitive territory.
It really is.
But it's not all churches. So lots of churches are doing good work to address pronatalism, right? And I think in Church of England, I think that's because there's a lot more women now in ordained ministry who are reflecting maybe on their own experiences, or they're a bit more aware of these dynamics socially, culturally, politically. And so lots of churches are trying to be much more sensitive around Mother's Day. Like a lot of my participants hate Mother's Day. One of them calls it heteronormative patriarchal day and doesn't go on Mother's Day because she's chosen not to have children and she's single. And in her reflections, she said, I can't go to days like that. It feels like I'm being punished, maybe, because I chose not to have children. And so maybe my being single is a reflection of that. I mean, she knows deep down that's not, what for her, that she doesn't think God would do that. But for her, that's a really painful reflection. And she just feels isolated and she feels she doesn't belong. So a lot of churches are recognizing that and are taking much more sensitive, inclusive steps to Mother's Day. They don't make people stand up with a bunch of flowers and give a bouquet to every woman, anymore. And they're thinking of alternative strategies. And lots of churches are thinking of ways of supporting and making space for women without children, whether that be childless by choice or not by choice. Right. But overwhelmingly, it's still this stigmatizing, secretive, slightly hidden phenomenon, particularly in Christianity in my work.
One thing I wanted to pick up on is the guilt factor, because I wonder how many women there are out there, particularly in Catholicism, where obviously guilt is a whole other massive part of it. Yeah. I can imagine that it must be so hard if you are, devoutly Catholic, but you also know that you don't want kids, to kind of, how do you cope with that guilt? And also, I wonder how many women it forces into having kids when they don't actually want them.
I think that's a really difficult question to answer. We'll probably never know, because if people do decide to have children, again, the pronatalism leaves very little room to discuss how difficult it is. You can't really have buyer's remorse. Once you've bought into that, it's really difficult. There's no space. And my participants who are mothers talk about that a lot. They're really angry that the church doesn't allow them the space because of that guilt. And one of my participants who was Catholic, she was getting married. Her and her partner didn't want children because they already had very heavy caring responsibilities for other family members. They were already doing that parenting. And in preparation for marriage, they went to their Catholic priest and said, can we have, there's a part in the vows which is about bringing children into the marriage in the Catholic service. And they wanted that removed. And they said, we can't do that. We can't promise that. We don't know what that means for us. And the priest wouldn't marry them. So they had to go and find a different parish and a different priest who was a little bit more understanding, shall we say. But that meant they felt very guilty about leaving the parish that they were invested in, right? Yeah. So, and I think the guilt, particularly with Catholic women, it comes from Mary. Not Mary herself, but the way Mary's presented and constructed as this idealized, perfect version of motherhood. And feminists have done a lot of work to critique that. And lots of individual Christian women, Catholic and non-Catholic, have their own versions of Mary that make sense to them. They retell these stories, and they retell and reimagine what Mary might mean in ways that resonate with their lives. That's what a lot of my participants do. But when she's sort of there, ever present in, she's portrayed as white and perfect. I mean, that's highly unlikely, if not likely at all. The white... the white outfits, the huge heart, the cradling the baby Jesus, it's too perfect, it's too idealized. No one can live up to that. Yeah. So I think the guilt comes from some of that. And the Catholic teaching, there is, the Pope Francis had 2 or 3 sermons where he chastised couples for delaying parenting, saying that they were too selfish, they were too focused on their holidays and their pets and their house renovations. So even without all that historical guilt, you often have key figures telling you again that you're doing wrong and you're not really being a very good Catholic.
Yeah, just totally reinforcing the whole story. Dawn, tell me a little bit about your own story. You alluded to it at the beginning about your own sort of reasons for not having kids. What did that look like for you?
I think, like most people, when I was growing up, and I did grow up with a Catholic household. My mum's one of 9 children from West Belfast. All of, I've got 45 cousins, right?
Wow.
At least 45. I don't know. I'm sorry to all my cousins who I'm like totally just forgotten about there, but I've got hundreds. And so I'm part of that I'm a product of that. So I think growing up, you know, I did imagine I would probably, you know, get married and have children, but that never really came. I think it came from school, that messaging, but it never came from my parents. My parents were always, well, if you get married and you might want kids. So there was space there. But it was really, I mean, I'm 48. It was really uncommon. I don't remember anyone in my mum's and dad's friendship group who didn't have children. I didn't have role models in that way. And then I started studying, and I kept traveling a bit and studying a bit. And my partner and I, we've been together, we lose count a bit because we're not married, about 25 years. And when we met and started to sort of hang out, we were living apart. I was doing my PhD, and then I went off traveling again. And so I didn't have to make a decision. It wasn't something we had to do. We weren't even living together. But I think the crunchy point came when we did move in together. We'd been together about 9, 10 years, and we finally moved in together, finally in the same place, in the same city. I'd finished my PhD. I just started my job at Chester. And suddenly everyone else kept asking, oh, now you've moved in, are you going to get married and have kids? You know, now you've got a proper job. Now you're not a student because you've been a student forever. You know, what is it going to be now? And there was just, you know, Lucy, there's just never been that massive pull that, I mean, lots of people talk about this. There's never been a huge, massive yearning. I like kids. I've got lots of kids in my life. People always say, do you like kids? I say, well, I wouldn't eat a whole one, but, you know, I like the ones that I like in my life that I've got. And of course, I'm friends with lots of young people. But that click that some people talk about, no, it never happened. And there were two things that really crystallized it. And I think we would go around the houses. We would sort of go, well, you know, how are you feeling about the kids question? You know, how are you feeling about getting married question? And at best, you know, either one of us was ambivalent and the other one was no. And that never seemed a very good foundation, right?
Right.
Like, oh, I'm not really sure, not quite bothered. And I know there was, and I have made decisions about my reproductive life that have meant that I have had a termination once, and I make decisions all the time about, you know, before perimenopause, Lucy, you know, when that thing was a live question,
I
we make decisions all the time about my reproductive choices. And there were two sort of crunchy points. There was one particular interview with one Catholic woman during the research, and her interview was just, she'd had children and she couldn't quite reconcile the sacrifice it had cost her. She'd wanted to be an academic, she wanted to do research, and she was just so deeply angry and so cross and hurt by, you know, about how her life had gone. Now, she loved her kids, that's fine, right? But that doesn't discount what other paths might I have taken, or who are the other selves I might have been.
This is such an important conversation, by the way.
Yeah.
I really like, yeah. It
right?
This fires me up because I wonder how many women feel like that, and rightly so. And like you say, it's not that they don't love their kids. It's not that she didn't love her kids, but she felt angry. And it's funny because that is exactly how I think I would have been if I'd had kids. Anyway, sorry to interject, but do carry on.
No, we don't use the word regret very much about choices, you know, or, well, regret comes, I think, if you've chosen not to have children, right? Well, how often do we get asked, do you think you'll regret it? Do you think really you've made the right decision? That barely gets asked of people who've had children. It goes back to that not being able to have buyer's remorse, as I said. Yeah. And that interview really stuck with me. And I phoned Bran straight away. He was having a really busy day, in work. It was the day Thatcher died, and he happened to work in the news archive. But I still thought this was a more important conversation to have. Phoned him, and he's just like, not now, really. Like, can we have this conversation another time? I'm a bit busy. And I just said to him, I don't think I can. I think I'm an either-or person, and I think if I have children, that'll be it. That'll be probably all I do. But I don't think I want to do that. I think I want to give everything I've got to this career that was burgeoning. And I couldn't see how I personally could juggle that. And that was the moment that I thought, you know, ambition, life, you know, what I want out of life is going to be more important, I think, at this stage. I think my mum and dad already knew, by the way, but I don't think I'd crystallized it.
How old were you at that point, Dawn?
I would have been about 33.
Right.
The early 30s, just when, you know, we just moved in together. All of these questions about what we were going to do, what our future was, were being asked of, apart from my parents, from friends and family. And then there was another moment when I was going on a program called Beyond Belief, which is a Radio 4 program about religion, and it was about childlessness. And I was just doing all the researchy sort of stuff, well, I've got this project and this is what it means. And, this is what pronatalism is. I was giving that academic sort of take on it. And then the researcher just went, and you'll be happy to talk about your own childlessness, yes? And I just was sort of like, oh, I've never actually used that term positively about myself and deliberately. I sort of felt a bit outed, but also, fine. I'm fine with that. That's okay, actually. That probably is a language that makes sense to me. We have chosen not to do this. And then I had to phone my mum up because I suddenly thought, oh no, I can't go on national radio without sort of talking to them first. So those two things sort of cemented it. Right. And I think, you see, sometimes, we do circle back to the conversation sometimes, usually because it's prompted by somebody else. Someone will say, oh, you two would have been great. Having kids, you two would have been brilliant. And I always say, well, yeah, it might be brilliant at lots of things, but I don't need to try them all. And I think sometimes it's not really that we've made a decision not to have children. I think we've just made a decision to love our life that we built for ourselves. And I think that's sort of where we've come to. And Bran increasingly doesn't, for him, the sort of childlessness label, it matters less and less to him. He doesn't really define himself in those terms at all. I think I do, because of the work that I do, and I think it's gendered, right? There's more scrutiny on me than there is on him ever about it, so he can afford to let it go. I think, pronatalism is a patriarchal structure. I have to keep pushing back on it, and by keep saying that I'm child free, or I'm childless by choice, or I don't have kids, that's just another sort of nail in patriarchy's coffin, as far as I'm concerned. So it helps. I think that's why I'm probably a bit more explicit about it. But sometimes I wish I didn't have to be. And I think those of us who are childless by choice, or child free, or childless not by choice, sort of wish it wasn't something we had to keep defining, redefining, keep explaining, keep justifying. It would be nice if it was taken off, or if we had
or if it was just a word thing.
We've got a word issue, haven't we? Why would I want to be? I'm not, the childless. I'm sure I know you've talked about that a lot, Lucy, but it never goes away. That word deprivation for the no script, it just doesn't go away. Totally. So I think that's why I land on those terms.
Right. It's funny because if I didn't have a podcast and I hadn't just written a book about being single and not having kids, the word child free wouldn't come out of my mouth. Before I started the podcast, I hadn't even heard of that word. Like, I wouldn't go around describing myself as that, because quite frankly, it's not who I am. Right. It's literally nothing to do with who I am. Well, actually, I suppose it is to do with who I am, not just because, I'm building a career on it, but because the reason I've been able to do the things that I'm currently doing is thanks to not having children. And I think this is one thing I feel so passionately about, is this complete disregard for all the sacrifices that are required to have children, and the fact that they are just so casually cast aside in favor of following the script and the narrative and all of that. It just maddens me. And the more conversations like this I have, and in fact the more I live my life and feel kind of more passionately, I've realized that actually one of the things I am most passionate about in this whole topic is how, in my case, being single and not having kids allows me to really, work on my passions and my dreams and throw my creative energy into other things. That's right. I think that is wonderful. I think it is one of the most wonderful side effects of being single and not having children. And again, it's just something we just don't talk about. We sort of undermine it. But as far as I'm concerned, it's like, it's huge. It's a really big deal. Why are we not all kind of rushing to sort of make the most of this opportunity? And this is one thing I go on and on about. It's like, it is an opportunity. Obviously this depends on where you're at in the journey of either being single and or childless. But, if and when you manage to shift your mindset to sort of see things from a more positive stance, the opportunity is right there in front of you. And I think it's such a shame that more people aren't seeing this for the wonderful advantage it is,
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of things, yes, but parenthood is both sort of valued and completely devalued in the way that you've just described, isn't it?
Yes.
Right? It's sort of exonerated. And like I said, it's privileged in so many ways. And it's seen as the site of ultimate fulfilling and meaning, which is religion helping us think about that, right? It's the ultimate site of giving, sacrifice, selflessness, community, all of those things. And when some of my participants, I'm going to keep talking about them, and because it relates a little bit to what you were saying, they're doing what you've just said. They're reimagining how God is calling them to be themselves, to be their whole authentic selves,
Right.
that doesn't rely on family, and being generative and contributing. They're saying, well, what I do in my day job, or what I do, my volunteer work, or what I do with my friends and family, that is being generative, that is contributing. And those stereotypes around the child-free and childlessness by choice and not by choice is being selfish. They're really entrenched, aren't they? We're still battling with that. So there's that really weird flip side, though. Like you said, parenting, it's a grind. It zaps, it changes you. It might be fulfilling, but it comes with an awful lot of baggage.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was sort of reflecting on when you were talking is that sometimes we may be a bit careful sometimes, but it's not an either or. It's not that your childless life is better. You're just finding ways to fulfill it that drive you, and you're content, and it gives you that space and that energy. And someone else might want to do something else, with that. But pronatalism doesn't let us see that. It discounts your experience, Lucy, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what it does. It's not centered around
Completely. And because I haven't had kids, it doesn't matter what else I might be doing, or what else any other childless woman might be doing. It's
right.
it is undermined. Exactly. It's undermined.
A plan B.
Exactly.
Which isn't helpful, which isn't always helpful if you wanted children and couldn't have them either. Because a plan B, might be seen as a secondary route and not quite good enough. So we need to keep troubling that message that it's the be all and the end all.
Totally. Dawn, I'd love you to talk a little bit about Storyhouse Childless. Now, basically, the Storyhouse Childless Festival is happening this weekend as this podcast goes out, not as we're recording. It's the 12th to the 14th of September, and this episode is going out on the 9th. Now, first of all, how did you get involved with this festival? And tell us all about it, really.
Oh, thank you. So Storyhouse is an arts and community library venue, all singing, all dancing site in Chester. It's beautiful, actually. It's beautiful. And it's been open since 2017. And as well as sort of hosting plays and productions and gigs and all that, it runs community festivals. And one of the first things it programmed was the Women's Festival when it first opened. And I was involved in that festival because of the work I do in Chester, because I research, gender and feminism and women's lives. I was asked to be part of the programming team, the volunteer programming team. And I've not long started the research on childlessness. So I said, what I'd really like to do is I'd like to have a panel on childlessness. Could I do that? So I was on the panel, and I invited Jodie Day, who has been a huge advocate and activist for childlessness, and somebody else called Lizzie Lowry, who is a Christian woman who is also an advocate for childless lives and Christianity. And we had this, brilliant discussion, the three of us, about how even though our childlessness was different, what did we have in common? What were the overlaps? Where were the stigmas? Where were the taboos? What were the challenges? How did pronatalism shape our lives as women? And then from that, someone from Chester community, so someone from the city, Kirsty Higson, she got in touch with Storyhouse and said, I couldn't go to that panel. It's great you've had it, but we need more of that sort of thing. You've got no idea how isolating it can be in a city, in any city, to be childless. Most places are family-centric. Could we do something? And the community project manager is Nicola Hay. And it was Kirsty that Nicola got in touch with. And Nicola just said, yeah, hang on, but I'll need to talk. Let's talk to Dawn and let's see what we can do. So we had the first, this is the 5th year we've been running. We had a break for COVID, but this is the 5th time the event's been held. And the first event, there were about 50 people in one room. And we went from 10 o'clock in the morning till sort of 5 o'clock in the evening. I think there were about 40, 50 people. Jodie Day came again. Someone called Yvonne John came. And there were talks and storytelling and just in poetry that just created that space. And for a day, nobody felt the stigma and the taboos and the isolation. People were able to share their grief and talk about their grief around childlessness, not by choice. There was space for people like me, who've chosen not to have children, to be in the same space together. And then the next year it got a bit bigger, and then the year after it got a bit bigger, and it's even bigger now. So it's 2 days of discussions, events. This year we've got a bit of a cabaret with some comedy and a bit of theatre. We often have authors who've talked about childlessness come over the years. We hit various themes, whether that's aging without children, whether that's how the environment might have impacted decisions. What does grief look like? How do you work with, family and friends around pronatalism? Why is it a problem in HR? What's the academic research on childlessness saying at the moment? This year, we've got themes on how art and childlessness come together through activism, which I'm excited about. We've got a session on intersectionality where we have a trans woman and a Muslim, queer, non-binary, hijabi wearing Muslim coming to talk about how all of their experiences around childlessness kind of compound with race, ethnicity, gender, religion. It's
fascinating.
It is. It's a really diverse festival, and everyone always sort of says, "Oh, is it quite challenging?" There are moments when it's challenging. There are moments when you're hearing experiences that don't resonate with yours necessarily, but there's such a connection that happens, and it's loads of fun. Like there's social time, but it's just a time for sharing and for raising awareness and for building friendships, really.
And do you have how does it work? Like, stupid question, but how does it work? Do you have lots of different rooms with different things going on in each room, or what? Can you tell us a little bit more about the sort of structure of it?
Yeah. So the program is really varied. So yes, there's sort of parallel sessions going on. So there might be a writing workshop.
Person.
Yeah, writing work. Sorry, is it all in person?
Yeah.
Yes, it's all in person. Yeah. It's all at Storyhouse. So then, there's a writing workshop going on at the same time as one of the other discussion sessions. So you can buy a weekend pass, or you can pick individual events that you're really keen on seeing. And yeah, there's a huge variety of stuff. It's a really full program. It's exhausting program in lots of really good ways. I'm always really emotionally full after it. I've made another 27 million new best friends and learn a lot. This is part of my research, and yet every session I go to, I learn something new, because when everyone tells a story from their perspective, right, it extends that story and it shares that story, and it teaches you something different or shines a light on something you've not heard of before.
Absolutely. And I hear that this year you have a panel about being both single and childless / child-free.
Yeah, we did last year as well. And it was a really enlightening and quite inspiring panel, because, like you were saying earlier, Lucy, that mixture of singleness and childlessness can often really heighten some of those isolating experiences. And it was quite refreshing. There were some people on the panel last year that were absolutely child-free by choice and had never wanted children, and that was not in their purview, and that was something they never really thought about and didn't want. And others who were childless not by choice. And that's something that we really try and hold together, is that all the different types of experiences. I mean, all the sessions represent very many different experiences of childlessness. And there's lots of overlapping experiences of childlessness. So, someone who began identifying as childless not by choice might not keep that identity. They might feel more child-free at some point in their lives and then revert back. So we're trying to hold that, and we're trying to give space to the ways in which these identities and experiences merge. Yeah. We're very clear about the messaging as well. So if we think if this might not be for you because of who you are and where you are in your journey, where you are in your story, and we make sure there's quiet spaces and there's people on hand to just help you out. And we're very encouraging of people taking time to look after themselves. If they need to leave at any time, then that's totally fine. There is that sensitivity, and we've marshaled that quite carefully. And the people that come are open to that, and they want to hear where those connections and where that solidarity comes from those experiences. Because actually, one of the most sort of poignant moments for me was on the men's panel. And we don't get very men coming. It's mainly women that come, but we actively encourage men, and we try and showcase men's experiences. So this year, for example, Robert Nurden, who's...
I've had him on the podcast.
Yeah, I thought you'd had Robert. So he's sort of showcasing his new play, right, about his experiences, about childlessness, men's and women's. But so Robert's been a loyal friend of Storyhouse Childless. So we do have events around men, but I remember, I think it was the second year that we ran the event, and there were 4 men, and they were all talking about their experiences of childlessness, and some childless by choice and some were child free. And one participant, he was childless, not by choice, and was still very much in his grief and very open about his grief and the bereavement. And he said to the other panelist who was child free, hearing you talk about how your life has meaning and purpose, and that you're not defined by having or not having children, just empowers me. It helps me understand that that's not all who I am. Yeah. And while I'll always have my grief, and you've told your story really sympathetically, you've given me space for my grief, even though you're child free. Yeah. It's sort of grist to the mill, right? It pushes back on those expectations, and it's those moments of connection that sort of give me goosebumps.
I love that. I mean, my own membership is for women without kids, whether they are child free or childless. And I'm sure that there are women in there who identify as childless who have absolutely been made to feel better because they hear from the women who are child free, because you can't help but have that rub off on you. Do you know what I mean? So it's and also, like, ultimately I would like to think we're all looking forward, so we all have that in common. Whatever the reasons are for us not having kids, all the people at Storyhouse Childless don't have kids, and therefore there's that commonality no matter what your story is and how you got there, how you got to that place. So,
and it changes the conversation.
Yeah.
Nobody starts off with that generic sometimes loaded pronatalist question, have you got kids? It's just not. And so everyone's just like, removed from that conversation entirely. And that's really refreshing.
I hadn't even thought of that, of course, because no one is... Yeah, I do you know what? I hadn't even thought, of course, at your festival, of course, no one's going, hi, so do you have kids? Because I mean, that must be refreshing.
Yeah, exactly. And we often sort of have a little session, childless bingo, what do you say in response to those things? And I remember that, we were doing childless bingo and someone just went, we don't have to play childless bingo here, do we? Like, no one's going to say stupid things to us or ask us stupid questions about having kids and us have to sort of find some clumsy way of skirting the issue or telling them fuck off. That doesn't have to happen. And there was just this like, oh yeah, then like this huge sort of sigh of relief.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
even that just having changes the conversation, and having somewhere like Storyhouse, which has a kids library, often puts on loads of kids things, which of course that's what communities include children, but to sort of front and center and quite boldly sort of go, actually this weekend there's a festival about childlessness going on, is quite a move, right? Like that's quite a thing. It doesn't happen very often.
No, it's so true. I love it. One thing I'm really interested to hear from you is any stories that you have of women or men who have moved from a place of identifying as childless to kind of moved across, if you'd like, to feeling child free. Do you have any stories like that you could share?
I think it's the language. I know we've said the language is really complicated, but there has been, since I started doing this work about 12 years ago now, the conversation is changing. There is more visibility and there is more nuance around adult lives and our reproductive identities and what that means. I mean, we clash into it, of course, all of the time in ways we've talked about. But, your work and other podcasts and the writing and there's just been this bit of a turn, I think, recently. Yeah. Celebrities are much more open about it. So I think that's giving people more options, right, in their language choices. And I think that's helping get away from a very fixed, stable, static identity. And in the academic literature, we're sort of talking about reproductive identities as a way of encapsulating things are fluid and they don't stand still, and that people do move through the course of their lives.
Mm.
And they probably always have, right? We just, because of the reasons we've talked about, they probably just haven't discussed it or haven't had the space to do that. So yeah, in my research, there was some women who had that experience. There was one participant who had been single all the way until her late 40s. And because she was Christian, she did want to get married and have children. And she thought marriage was the space for children. But when I interviewed her, she had just got married and they could have decided to have children, but they'd only just got married, only just set up home together, only just sort of started their lives. And she was sort of like mid-40s and was thinking, well, actually, I'm okay with that now. And actually, it makes sense to say, I want to name this for myself. This is my life. And I want to name that as being child-free. So she said, yeah, I'd probably say I was childless by circumstance with a bit of child-free and maybe a bit of ambivalence thrown in. And I'm hearing more and more stories like that. And there is something about the passing of time, I think. And I think for those childless not by choice, saying that you're childless not by choice is really important because it names that grief.
Yeah.
And that grief doesn't go away and we shouldn't expect it to go away. And grief looks different for childless, child-free people too. There can be grief and regrets and doubts there too, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it does something about maybe with the different life stages that you're at. So I've got a really good friend, and she once said to me, if I'd have known you when I was in my 20s and and I was knowing my infertility journey and knew what was ahead, and I don't think I could have been friends with you because you were child free and I was going through that grief.
Yeah.
But now she can.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now there's that space. And while I don't want to collapse, you don't want to collapse those experiences. And that is another reason, Lucy, why I say I'm childless by choice, because I don't want people to assume that I'm childless not by choice. That's not my experience. And it's already collapsed in a lot of people's heads. When people write those explanations onto you and so the language, I think, is important. But again, I think there's something about moving through that grief for some people, which means they can use and they find that child-free or that child-free language helpful, and because also, it doesn't reflect where they were in the midst of their grief, and their life has they've gone other ways with their lives, and that they need to own, and they want to own that. So I think that does happen.
I also wonder whether after a certain amount of time, although how you quantify that amount of time, I don't know. And I want to say this very delicately, but I wonder whether sometimes at some point, certain labels don't actually help people moving forward. And I would say this not just about anything around not having kids. It can be all sorts of things to do with mental health issues or behavioral issues, whatever it is. I think there is an argument to say that it's not always helpful. It absolutely can be helpful, like you so rightly pointed out. It is important to label it when you're going through grief. But I wonder whether in some cases it becomes unhelpful. Do you know what I mean?
I do. And I think you're right to be really sensitive about that and cautious about it. I've got some really close friends who are childless, not by choice, and they're never without their grief, but they're using that term less and less because it's associated with the grief that they're trying to move away from.
Right.
And they're doing a lot of work to try and reconcile what they wanted and what they longed for and what they've already loved and lost, actually, with what that means. And I think having these sorts of conversations and having events like Childless at Storyhouse means that it opens up, like we were saying earlier, it opens up different languages and different terms and different experiences. And hearing someone else who doesn't have that experience of grief and doesn't use that term, like you said, can help. I think it can help.
Yeah.
But you can't ever tell somebody when they're ready to let go of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's up to them, I think.
I would love to just ask you, before we start wrapping up, in relation to the couple of friends that you were talking about who are childless and not by choice, who have been trying to move through their grief, what has that looked like for some people? Like, I'd love for anyone who is struggling with that, and I know people who are still struggling with the grief of not having had kids. What have you seen that actually helps I mean, I know that's a
No, it's a really important question. And I mentioned Jodie Day earlier, and she founded Gateway Women, which is friendly to men too. Men are included in Gateway Women. I have had friends who've gone through Jodie's weekends and her support networks and that wider global community that she's established, and they've told me it saved their life.
Wow.
So for some of my friends who are childless, not by choice, and these are the sorts of stories that you do hear at Childless. People share these sort of experiences at Storyhouse Childless. It's been a matter of life and death for them. I had one friend say to me they were on holiday and they knew that the IVF was running out and it wasn't looking good. And she jumped into the sea of the boat to go for a swim. And she looked out and she just thought, that's it, I'm going to keep going. That's it. This is not the life for me. The grief was so overwhelming and so consuming, partly because there's no space for it.
Yeah.
Right, you know, it's the silencing and the hiddenness and the stigma and the taboo. These are stories that we don't hear very often. So the grief isn't given a name, so it just stays with them, and it can be not starting to heal. It's an existential, painful, you know, question that can bring people to that sort of brink. So this is not to be taken, you know, lightly, and that's the problem. It's often people's responses are often glossing over that. Oh, have you thought about adoption? Have you thought about IVF? Can't you just get a dog? Oh, well, you didn't really want kids anyway, did you? You're probably better off without them. These are real responses that people who are childless, not by choice, hear all the time. Or you walk into work and, you know, there's one story, somebody that I know just had a miscarriage, going through pregnancy loss again, and was asked by their boss to arrange the whip round for the woman who just had a baby and was on mat leave. Okay. So the grief is not recognized if you've not been through it, and it's haunting and it rips people apart. It rips lives apart. And what can help is the sharing of stories and knowing that there are people like you who understand a little bit of what you're going through.
Yeah.
And can give comfort and support and understanding. And don't rush that. You know, if there's anybody listening who knows someone who's going through this, you can't rush the grief. You just got to sit with them and be there, and refrain from those, you know, quite trite, comforting advice. It might happen. Don't worry, maybe next time. Oh, I'm sorry, this is your 9th miscarriage and pregnancy loss, but maybe the 10th will be the one for you. You can't make those promises. You just have to sit and you just have to be with them, and point them to places where they'll meet. They might hear stories that help them, and knowing that other people get through it. That's why Storyhouse Childless works for those who are childless not by choice, because you see people who have moved through it, and that's incredibly encouraging and kind. It's an act of kindness, really, to share that story and to hope that someone else can, you know, gain a little bit of hope. But yeah, so I'm not just saying this because Storyhouse Childless does this, but that's what's helped. And time, sometimes therapy, lots of therapy, lots of expensive holidays. One of my friends swears that house music has saved her. You know, just keep on dancing to house music. The things that make you feel you and centered are the things that my friends have reported help them.
I think the hardest thing, or one of the hardest things about the grief of not having kids, is the fact that a lot of people probably think, well, what are you grieving? You didn't have a child. Therefore, well, what, you know, why is this even grief? And I think it's that massive misunderstanding that is probably one of the hardest things that women who really are grieving it must find, that it's that dismissal of the fact that, well, how could it be grief? You know, you haven't lost anything. You didn't have a baby, so how can you be grieving a baby that you never had? That kind of thing.
You have hit the nail exactly on the head. It's the absence. How can you grieve an absence? How can you grieve for something that you didn't know what it looked like, or sounded like, or felt like, or touched like, or smelled like? How can you do that? How can you do that? For women, there's definitely something about the failure of the body that's really resonant. So not only are they failing society expectations or religious expectations or family expectations, but they've failed somehow. And the language around pregnancy loss is often couched in failure, like the word miscarriage, right? So it's why pregnancy loss is probably a better term. It's about how your body's let you down and you can't do what it's supposed to do, right? We're stuck with this essentialism. Go back to what I was saying right at the beginning, right? What are women supposed to be? What are women supposed to do? The body, they feel that the body has let them down, and for men, they feel their bodies let them down too. But that's wrapped in issues, presentations, constructions of masculinity and what you're supposed to be, a strong, virile, potent man. They were so gendered, and the grief around that too, and that compounds the grief, that sense that your body has failed you. And then partners sometimes feel that they failed each other, right?
Yeah.
It feels like it's somebody's fault, and the medical discourse around that doesn't help. You're sent for tests, diagnosed, you're tested for things. You've either got enough sperm or you haven't got enough sperm. It's either strong enough or it's not strong enough.
Yeah. And I'm sure there must be
some,
totally. And I'm sure there are probably some women who desperately wanted a baby, and then their husband or partner gets diagnosed as, having whatever issue with his sperm. And it's only human to be like, fucking hell.
Yeah.
Oh, I can totally see how, even though it's completely unreasonable, I can completely see how that is a normal human reaction if you're a woman that really wants a baby, and then you find out that your husband's the one that's got the physical issue, and then there's kind of a bit of blame going on. Again, totally human and natural. But I can see that actually trying, I mean, I've never been in this position, but I can see how trying desperately for a baby can put so much pressure on couples, and I imagine in some cases it probably drives them apart.
And there's lots of different reasons why people don't want or can't have children, loads, and they all kind of merge.
It's so nuanced.
Poverty, addiction, mental health, the social structures and the legal structures that prevent gay couples from having children in various places will make it very difficult for that. The way in which there's actually secondary childlessness, where you might have had one birth success. They even, in the medical language, it's even called a successful birth. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But you can't, for some reason, there's a reason why you can't have another, or when one partner wants a child and the other doesn't, or if the partners are at different ages, which means that that's difficult, or delaying having children can put more physical, social, mental pressure on that. So there's all sorts of reasons, and they all can all merge, and it just means that it's all, as with all of these things, Lucy, it's always way more nuanced and complicated than it first seems.
100%. Dawn Llewellyn, it's been so fascinating to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. Before we wrap up though, can you just tell our listeners, if they want to get a ticket for this weekend's festival, Storyhouse Childless in Chester, what do they need to do?
If they go to the website, so you can just Google Storyhouse Childless.
I'll put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, storyhouse.com. So if you put that in, just go to the website, you'll get a list of the program and all the different events. So you can sign up for just one or two events, or come for the weekend, or just come for one of the days. And we kick off on the Friday night with a social, a bit of a mixer to get the party started. So if you're coming solo, or if you're coming with friends, or you're coming with your partner, you can come and meet people who'll be in the audience, and meet some of the speakers, meet me. I make sure I speak to everyone at least 10 times while they're there. And that'll sort of warm you up a little bit. And then we kick off the next day. So yeah, it's a full lively program, and you can find out everything at Storyhouse's website.
Fabulous. And what about following on social media for Storyhouse? What are their handles?
Hashtag Storyhouse Childless, and then at Storyhouse Live.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. It really has been a joy to speak to you. And is there anything else, before we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to tell our listeners about Storyhouse before we really do finish?
I don't think there's anything other than come and bring your friends, and bring your friends' friends. And there's room for everyone. And it's a really special weekend.
Cool. Thank you so much for your time. Sending you lots of love.
And you. Thanks, Lucy.
Oh.